Begin. Today is the 22nd of December, 1991. We're at the home of Michael Novice in San Jose, California. The interviewers for this Holocaust survival interview are Daniel Leeson and Sheila Hochman. Operating the camera is Dick Reisner. Mr. Novice, I wonder if you would begin by telling us your full name, your place of birth, and your date of birth.
I was born on June 15, 1927, in Warsaw, Poland. And the name at my birth was somewhat more complicated than the present last name, Novice. It was, in fact, Sos Novice. May have been related to a town that is in the southern part of Poland, but it's called Sosnowiec or something like that. So I was born in Warsaw, and I lived there all the time until the war came up, which means that when the war broke out in 1939, I was 12, going on 13. And so up to the year of 1939, I had what I would regard a normal childhood, being mainly concerned with school and homework and playing around. My parents had 4 children, so I was one of 4. Now, at home there were only 3. The reason being that my oldest brother was 15 years older than I was. So when I was 3 in 1930, he left Warsaw for Paris to study there. And so, right, as I said, I just had one other brother, David, and a sister. And as I mentioned, I've got a few photographs. And at this point I can say outright that it's very unusual to have photographs because you couldn't really take them out with you. Not only photographs, but anything else. It was just unheard of. It was just impossible. Because on the way you always went to sort of like naked into one place and out through another, leaving everything behind you. So the only way I have these photographs is because they were taken at our home, and then they were mailed to my brother living in Paris, and he survived, and he gave them to me. So really up to 1939, I don't really think that I can say anything which isn't generally known. We lived in the heart of the Warsaw Ghetto. So when you hear of the Warsaw Ghetto, where other people were from all over Europe or from all over Poland, were eventually asked to leave their homes and go to Warsaw Ghetto, our home was right in the center, so we did not have to move. We were right in the center, except we had to take some people in, friends, relatives, anybody who had to be there just to obtain shelter was stayed in our home. Another thing which I recall from our home is that my parents, although all the children were born in Warsaw with my brother, the oldest, one who went to Paris, he must have been born in 1912 or 1911. Had he been born in 1912, in 1930 would have been 18, which I believe was about the right age when he lived. In 1912, he too was born in Warsaw. So my parents must have married in Warsaw, perhaps 10 or something like that. But they themselves were not born in Warsaw. They were born in a little place called Opatów. I possibly can hardly find it on a map, but it's in the southern part of Poland, not far from a place called Ostrowiec, which is perhaps a little bit more known. And why do I say that? I just lost my train of thoughts. But anyway, we lived in Warsaw, yeah. I remember that because my parents lived in Warsaw, but their relatives and possibly their parents, I never knew my grandparents, they must have died young. I remember at home, our place was usually filled with people who had to come to a big city like Warsaw to receive medical attention, or perhaps they emigrated to Canada or to America, and there was always a need to go to the consulate or something like that. So there were, whenever they needed to be in a big place like Warsaw for official purposes, they were in our home. And sometimes they were there for weeks and months on end. So our home was always full, you know, like a stop-off station.
Can you tell me, please, the full name of your father and mother?
And that's where the difficulty comes too, incidentally. The last name, as I said, was Novice. And it was spelled in different ways. In particular, after the SOS, some members of the family put an I, so it was Novice. Some put a Y, some, as I think we did towards the end, or I did definitely, there was nothing there. So that was the last name, as I said, spelled in sort of various ways.
But the first name?
The first name is again a difficulty, because I always refer to my father as Tate, and my mother was Mame. But I've heard other people call my mother Basha. Now Basha happens to be, can be a Hebrew name, which reads Batya, and it really means, translated from the Hebrew, means the daughter of God, Bath, which is a daughter, yeah, so from Shem. But on the other hand, it's also a Polish name. So if you see a person, a female coming from Poland, her name is Basha, then she is not necessarily Jewish. And my father's name was Herschel, or everybody called him Herschel. Now Herschel is a diminutive of Hirsch, and Hirsch is the Yiddish or the German from the Hebrew Tzvi.
Meaning deer.
Deer, that's correct, deer. And I believe his second name was Abraham. And it can very well be, because I've been myself asking sort of people who sort of knew my parents, and my sister and my brother who survived the war, as incidentally they're not alive now, about the names. And I believe my father's full name was Abraham Hirsch Sosnovitz, but he was known as Herschel, Hirsch.
What was the name of your brother who moved to Paris?
His last name was Charles, but he was not born as Charles. His Hebrew name must have been Yehoshua, but in the family he was known as Shia, which is sort of like, you know, the last syllable of the word Yehoshua. And so people, well, as I said, I did not really know him before the war, so I didn't hear people address him, but my parents used to refer to him as Shia, and that was a pretty common Yiddish name, Jewish name in Warsaw, I mean in the Polish life.
And the name of your sister?
My sister's name, there again, it's the Hebrew and the non-Hebrew. She was known as Chela, which is close to Helen, but her name was Chela. The Hebrew was Chaya. And So, and then I had another brother, the one I didn't know, and we lived in the same home, the same room. His name was a simple one, no matter which way, it was David. So there was no difficulty about that.
What did your father do for a living?
He had a small factory of children's hats. And at the same time, he also saw that coats that went with the hat were made by other people. So he made them for wholesale. So my father was the help already of my brother David, with the help from outside. You know, they were manufacturing these things, and then they were selling them to stores. And my mother was the sales lady, so she was the businesswoman.
Did you sell from the house, or did he have an office in the factory from where he sold?
No, it was all sort of attached to the house. An apartment, in fact. It was a fairly large apartment.
Although you mentioned you did not know any of your four grandparents, did you happen to know their names?
No, strange enough, I did not know the name.
Did your parents ever speak of their parents?
No, not no.
You are not certain then if your grandparents were from Warsaw or even Poland?
No, they must have been from Poland. Or from Russia or something like that. But they did not live in Warsaw. I think my parents may have met in Warsaw and married in Warsaw, but they came possibly looking for jobs. And we have to recall that was the beginning of the 19th century, and there could have been a depression, 1910, 1920. So.
What amusements did your family do together, your sister and your brother David and yourself, with your parents?
Amusements?
Did you go to the theater, perhaps?
Yeah. Mainly the movie house, cinema, and a theater. I'm not so sure that I did go to a theater, perhaps once or twice. And if it was a theater, it would have been a Yiddish type theater. And there were some pretty well-known theaters, especially in Warsaw. I remember one sort of, they used to talk about this play called The Dybbuk. And so that was the sort of big, the original, you know, if I can put it that way, the original play of The Dybbuk, and the big actors. But I was too young, sort of, I wasn't all that much interested in that. But I did go to some musical concerts, and in fact I was interested in an instrument, and I played the violin for about 3 years before the onset of the war.
Do you remember the exact address that you lived at in Warsaw Ghetto?
Yeah. I do remember. In fact, there's one other little thing which I have here, which I can show later, is an actual postcard written from my home to Paris, not to my brother, but to a relative in Paris, asking him if he knows the whereabouts of my brother in Paris. So, of course, not only do I remember, but it's also on the postcard. I've got the address, and the name of the street was Zamenhof, or Zamenhofer. And Zamenhof, the name is a relatively known name, or it used to be, insofar that it was the name of a Jewish doctor, Dr. Zamenhof, and he was the inventor of a language called Esperanto. So this is why the street was called after him.
What was the number on Zamenhof?
Number 18, flat 30. So that's definitely pretty well documented. But my memory is such that although I knew the name, I do not recall any sort of, it was a fairly long road. I do not remember any crossroads. I don't know which part of Summerhof it was.
Were Jews restricted to the ghetto before the war?
No, I don't think they were restricted, but it was not safe to live outside Warsaw Ghetto.
Could you amplify on that?
Amplify? Well, even living in the ghetto as I did, I remember going, say, to a recreational ground, a park, which was a park for everybody's use. So it was already bordering on the non-Jewish section too. And we was very frequently afraid to go there, especially in the evening, because if you were recognized as being Jewish, you were attacked and beaten up, sometimes beaten up very, very much so. And another thing I remember being told was that on certain occasions, certain times of the year in particular, the people were so antagonistic that it was literally unsafe to be even in the ghetto. And that particular time of the year was Easter time, as distinct from Christmas time, which was sort of, it was definitely a big holiday. One could see it everywhere, and the business was sort of brisk even for Jewish merchants, but it was somehow safe. But when it came Easter time, we heard quite a lot of people being stabbed for no reason, and they're Jews. And that was a very, well before the Nazis. It was just anti-Semitism. So this is definitely a thing that I do remember.
What languages did you speak at home?
We definitely had to be bilingual. In my particular case, it was Yiddish and Polish. Yiddish in the home and Polish in school and everywhere else. But then at school, of course, I went to Hebrew schools. I knew Hebrew, and when I was a little older, we started learning languages: English, French, Latin. So when I was 13, I could understand German from the Yiddish, and of course we had to understand German during the war, and of course Polish, we had to. But it could be that the Polish was sort of tinted with somewhat of an accent, which was a big drawback, because if you wanted to not to have your religion disclosed, it could have been very difficult. And in my particular case too, I can say that I did not stay to the very end of the Warsaw Ghetto, because had I stayed there until the end, I wouldn't be here. And the end was in 1943, and I left in 1941. And when I left, the beginning of my leaving was smuggle myself out and be on the other side of the ghetto, and I had to speak Polish and pretend I'm not a Jew. And had it been found out that I was a Jew, I would not have been here. So the Polish had to be pretty polished up, so to say, in order not to have this accent, which we did have, on account that we really spoke Yiddish. That was our sort of known as the Mameloshen, the mother's tongue.
Did you live in a traditional Jewish household?
Yeah.
Your parents were observant?
Yeah. Perhaps not as observant as some, but again, I've got to be pretty careful what I say. First, the religiosity of people living in Warsaw, in a big town, was somewhat different from those living in the province. And so it was sort of more, I don't I would use the word modernized or something, And we definitely observed the Sabbath. And that's sort of one of the main recollections that I have of our home. Yeah. Yeah. And another thing I seem to recall, shortage of food, was very great at the beginning of the war. And if there wasn't kosher meat, my mother just wouldn't buy. Yeah, I seem to remember, in particular, there was, at the beginning of the war, there was meat from a horse's meat available. And the reason why it was available was because the Polish army used horses instead of tanks against the German army. And all the horses that fell in the battle was sort of available for food. And I remember some people we knew had the horse meat, but we did not. So this is sort of just an answer to your question about the religious status.
How old were you when you began school?
Possibly pretty early, 5 or 6.
Where did you go? To a cheder, or was there a state school?
No, it was a Jewish paid school. So it was just like perhaps compared to this South Peninsula Hebrew Day School here, where we had the secular and the Jewish at the same time.
Were there opportunities for Jewish children to go to the state schools and mingle with Christians? Or did Jewish students always go to the
I believe that,
cheder?
I must say that I'm possibly not the right person to ask because I wasn't sort of like old enough. All I know was that my brother went to that same school as I did, and my sister went to Bes Yaakov, which is a girls' Hebrew school. I wasn't so sure. I wasn't sure whether my parents selected the school because they wanted us to be to this school, or that just wasn't another school. But I do know, though, that it was very hard for someone like the higher classes, the higher education, to be accepted in that school. And I think that was one of the reasons that my brother, at the age of 18, left home and went to Paris. And he went there for studying, to study.
In retrospect, before the period began to become difficult in the late 30s, do you recollect having a pleasant childhood? Were your parents loving to you? Did you enjoy yourself as a child?
Yes, yeah. We had a happy home. My parents were always very busy with work. The only time we sort of we had a little bit of time was during the school vacation, which was in the height of summer, and then my mother took the children to a vacation spot. And also somehow my mother suffered from rheumatism, so she went to one of those places where they had these special bath and drinking water, like a spa. And some of the pictures which I have here were taken in those places. Because they, again, according to my recollection, picture taking was not very common. Not like just now where everybody starting from that age, they've got a little camera and get pretty good results. But on vacation, the places, there were these professional people who made a living out of snapping people on the street and sending you their proofs. And the proofs were so good you just couldn't refuse to order some more. So,
Did you have friends as a child?
school friends, yeah.
Do you remember some of their names?
No, really, no.
Before we finish this section on your childhood, before the situation in Poland began to get difficult, would you like to show us some of the pictures that you have representing this period?
Well, I've got here one of the oldest pictures taken in 1930, I believe. Don't know where I came to notice 1930, because I do know the main purpose of taking it. You see, this is sort of like a posed picture, where there's my parents here, my father, my mother, and I'm here in the center. And on one side is my sister, and on one side is my brother. And this picture was sent to my brother in Paris for him to see, kind of a souvenir. And
Could you hold just a moment, sir? Now hold that picture just as you were holding it. Put it down on your knee, or yeah, wherever, so it's comfortable, and hold it real steady. I'll get in real close on it. Just hold it real still.
That's David.
yeah,
There were you and your mother Basha,
Yeah.
and your father Avraham Tzvi.
that's correct.
But the sister's name, I have it, is
Chaya or Chela.
Chaya. Did you finish?
Very good.
Do
Okay.
you have another from this period?
Well, I've got,
Mentioned?
let me show you the very last one, possibly just like, that's a much smaller one, possibly just like, this could have been 9 years later. So here I'm almost like a grown-up boy, and it's my, so
That's your mother in the middle?
my mother in the middle, flanked by myself on one side, and my sister, who was 2 years older, on the other side.
That was taken very near your house?
No, this was not. This was taking one of those spa places.
I see.
This is sort of an enlarged version of my mother again.
Also at a spa?
Also, it's a spa, yes, because this is sort of what she carries in here, is sort of like a little special drinking cup.
Would you hold that up for a moment so that he can get that?
Okay, in on it.
Do you remember where the spa was?
Yeah. One was called Krynica.
Mm-hmm.
It was on the border of Czechoslovakia, down south.
It's been
Okay. You know what would work with this one? We hold it, bring it out, put it on the table or something, so I can get a little closer to it. Maybe I can get a close-up of that drinking thing you're talking about.
You want me to show that little thing that you have that was Sandy?
Well, actually, it doesn't come through. I've got another smaller picture where she's here in another place with this ringing thing, but perhaps it's not all that of importance. I don't know what to say. Here I've got yet another shot here, and this is a little Rosh Hashanah card with a picture of myself and my sister. That seems to have been fashionable at that time. And it says still Lashon Tova.
Mm-hmm.
Second.
And these survived only because your brother in Paris had them.
Right. And he in turn had to leave it. He was also on the run because Paris wasn't a safe place. But he left it with our relative. And the relatives were somehow like older people, and they were allowed to stay in Paris.
Okay, Dick?
Yeah.
Thank you. Do you have anything you would like to add at this point, Sheila? Sure.
Mr. Novice, you said that you can remember Shabbat, and that I was wondering, were there any other holidays that you remember celebrating with your family, and perhaps family that came in from other places to Warsaw? Do you have any recollections of any other holidays other than Shabbat?
Oh, sure. Yeah, but all holidays, not just, for instance, the big holiday of Pesach, with all the matzahs and that I help or carry from the bakery to our home. And they were not the machine-made matzah, they were sort of more, they were all handmade, round, and put in a paper bag, like a cardboard box from a hat, and sort of piled on, and we carried them home, and we were there when they were baked. So, and of course the Seder, everything that, I being the youngest always had to say ask the 4 questions. We had to sleep before, and some of us fell asleep during the Seder, so. And then of course after, say, Pesach come, and of course the whole life round about the Pesach time in Warsaw was really something that could never be reproduced here. All the merchants on the street selling you the food and the fish and special cutlery for people to buy the Pesach stuff, and recall how the utensils had to be kashered, in hot water. So there were people made a living out of that. They somehow carried a big drum of water from one block of apartments to another block of apartments, and they sort of shouted out, and people came down the stairs and whatever, and they used it in a communal way. And in Shavuos too was a nice recollection. Our particular home, we had the custom of putting green branches on the walls. So that was Shavuos and cheesecake. So that was sort of like traditional, and I think every Yom Tov had its special meals.
Did you have a sukkah?
We had a sukkah, yeah, but it was a communal sukkah for all people who lived in this apartment. See, we did not live in a house with our own grounds, and so I think all the inhabitants there of that complex got together and they built a sukkah, and because sukkah was not all that large, accommodated everybody, it was mainly for the men to sit in the sukkah and eat. So I remember being one of the children, we had to carry the food from our kitchen to the sukkah. So I and my sister did the carrying, and if there was, I think there was always some room there for a child to squeeze in and have the meal there too. And then, of course, the high holidays like Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. For Yom Kippur, remember there was no question about fasting, but it was an enormous candle, sort of perhaps the height of about 3 foot, which we don't see, and that sort of was the main source of light. So that's one thing that, a small thing, but I seem to remember that. Yes, and of course Hanukkah, observed in the traditional way. If we observe it anyway here, it's sort of like carry over for it was in the old country, with dreidels and bagels and what do you say, dreidels and latkes, yeah. And
where did you daven? Did you go to daven in a large central synagogue, or was it something?
No, we had a small. My father used to go to a smaller synagogue. I could not tell the name of that synagogue, know exactly where it was. But from time to time, we used to go to a larger synagogue, but we went there only in the evening, because to go there in the morning required membership, which we did not have to that. And that was one of the main synagogues, the one I'm referring to that we went. And a big cantor at that time was a person called Kusavitsky, Moshe Kusavitsky. So he was the chazan, and people used to sort of pick up the tunes and the melodies of him and just sang it or used it throughout the whole year. So, well, various other little things that one goes through childhood, but unless one sort of stops and thinks about it, one just tends to forget and gloss them over. But it was just a natural, rich life, really rich in Jewishness.
Was there a distinct difference in the character of life
Immediately preceding the German invasion of Poland in 1939 for the Jews? Or was it just an ongoing life and suddenly it changed as the Germans invaded?
It was a big change, yeah.
It was not sudden. It was sudden.
Sudden, very sudden. But you see, perhaps people living in other places would give you a different answer than I'm giving you, because it was Warsaw. First of all, Warsaw was bombed. So already, like just a few days after the war started, people already lost their lives and already lost their houses. And our complex itself, a bomb fell. And it was an enormous roar, noise when it fell. It destroyed a small building in that complex, but fortunately the apartments where we lived did not get damaged, except for sort of a crack in the wall, which stayed there with us for the rest of the war. Well, for the rest, as long as I lived there, could not be repaired.
What was the feeling of the Jewish community after the war began? Was there any recognition as to the difficulties that the Jews would face? Or was there no understanding of the role of the Jews in the Nazi plan?
Well, we didn't know what to expect. We didn't expect anything good to come out, because after all it was known what Hitler was for, what was after. But what we may not have quite known is the reaction of the Polish population, and that was very hostile. And I think most of our suffering comes from their attitude. A small example, soon after the war, within just a few weeks, there was a shortage of food and people had to line up. So, like you see the lines on TV in Russia, that was exactly, whether it was bread or fruit. So there was a line formed, and then somehow the German soldiers were already marching on the street to keep order. And then the Polish people called the Germans and to say he's a Jew. So he got thrown out from the line, so he couldn't get any food and nothing. So these are the recollections which I have, and that has really came as I'm not so sure that it's a big surprise, but it was an important happening that really led to the destruction of the thing, and that is the hate of the Jews by the Polish inhabitant. So much so that that's my own feeling, that the Germans themselves may not have had a real big plan at the very beginning. They sort of just played it by ear. And when they could see that the whole population was helping them to seek out and to punish and destroy the Jews, they just did it. Had they seen the very opposite, had they, for instance, been like the people in Holland, where the whole population was completely different from what it was in Poland, they could very well be that they would not have dared or would have not have tried to do what they did. But since they were encouraged by the Polish people, there was just no stopping.
How soon after the bombing?
Did you see your first German soldiers?
Very soon, very soon. I remember during the bombing, we had to be in cellars, and streets were collapsed. And when it was all finished, there was this stench of burned out houses. And our whole street, this Zamenhof Street, had many, many houses that were bombed to rubble.
When the Germans came into Warsaw, was there any immediate action on their part against the Jews, or were they simply busy occupying the town?
The immediate action was that they needed people to do some work for them. For instance, the winter was setting in. It was already end of September, October. And if they needed some people to unload or load trucks to clear, say, the airport later on, like November or something, of snow, what they used to do is to come in the Warsaw Ghetto. Well, it wasn't a ghetto, but say the district, and just they recognize the Jewish people, and you just grab them and put them on trucks and took them away. And they took them away, nobody knew where to, but in order to carry out certain manual tasks, be it loading or unloading or washing or clearing or whatever. But everybody regarded very lucky that these people came back, especially if they came back on the same day. So I remember these German trucks coming and people running off the street in order not that they knew what was coming, and those who managed to run and hide were all right, and those who did not manage to run fast away were taken. And as I said, they put to work, and they were pretty lucky to come back. Some did not come back. Some may have been killed on the spot because of one thing or another, and some may have been just shot. So this was my first encounter with them. If the war started on the 1st of September, what I'm describing could have happened in October. So that's in answer to your question, how it was evidence that they were there immediately.
How did the war impact you personally? Could you continue in school, for example?
No, there was no school. There was no school.
Was that a German decree that all Jewish schools had to stop?
Yeah. Decree all Jews had to stop, and no gathering, no opening of synagogues. All radios had to be turned in. So your house, if you had a radio, you really risked your life. And as I said, there was a shortage of food. I seem to remember also, just by sheer coincidence, the first winter of 1939-94 was a very cold winter. And Warsaw, like Moscow, there get very cold. And there was no water because something was bombed, and we had to go for miles to the nearest main river, which was the Vistula. That's the main river that passes through Warsaw, and carry buckets of water. And it was pretty contaminated, dirty water, but people had to use it.
How did the war impact your family? Could your father continue in his business?
Just a little bit, a fraction of the business. But it was still possible to mix with the non-Jewish people, to sort of go and see all the clients. And so some business did go on for perhaps a year and a half.
How did you get food?
It was just always a question of lining up and getting the food when it became available. It was a really main task to get food. even if he had the money to buy it.
Was that true for the non-Jewish population of Warsaw?
Could be, except that I did not see it, I did not witness it. Because the part where I lived was mainly Jews, with some non-Jews.
Did the communal life within the ghetto continue? Were there still hidden schools? Were children taught? Were
Yeah.
religious services held? Was the
I
Shabbat
think,
observed?
yeah, I think there was. Yeah, in fact, one teacher from my previous school taught us in his own home, and that carried on for about half a year. And my parents sent me there because they just did not know what to do with me, sort of keep me out of house or sort of soften the blow of the war. And there must have been about half a dozen of children that age, 13, who went to that particular person. He was actually not a secular teacher, not a religious teacher. And he taught us German and Latin and history and this, that, and that. And I remember on one session we had there, someone must have squeaked on him or something, because the German soldiers, or Gestapo, I don't know who they were, came, they knocked at the door, arrested him, and threw us kids out, and that was the end of the thing. We never saw the teacher again.
Do you remember his name?
No.
Did you ever have occasion during the 2 years from the beginning of the war until 1941, when you left the ghetto, to visit the non-ghetto portion of Warsaw? The Christian portion?
Not so sure that I did, but I think my mother did, and my sister. It was somewhat safer for ladies to move around. And if we wanted to make contact still with all clients or so, that had to be the case. And if one wanted to perhaps purchase something, it would have been easier to do there. But always under the pretense that you were not a Jew.
You said earlier that you left the ghetto in 1941 under difficult circumstances. Could you describe the events leading up to your leaving the ghetto?
Well, food was becoming very, very scarce. So, and I think as a result of the shortage of food, I was sort of began to physically suffer. So my parents decided to send me to the relatives of the hometown or the home region, which must have been about 200 or 300 miles south of Warsaw. And people living in the smaller places had it somewhat easier. The ghettos were not so strongly enforced, and there was food grown in the nearby fields. So I don't know how it came to be. This is another thing which I do not remember for some reason. I don't know whether my parents consulted me or they asked me or something like that. It was somehow arranged that I leave the ghetto, and that was soon after Pesach of 1941. Now the Passover, the Pesach of 1940 was already bad, but it was just like, was it about 7 months after the war, so it was sort of like manageable stuff. But as time went on, it was worse and worse and worse, and 1941, the Pesach was really very bad. Very little to eat. Remember when my mother managed to get a bread in a store or something, she was in danger, bring the thing from the store home, because hungry people attacked her and grabbed her paper bag or whatever she carried it in and just ate it on the spot. So in 1941, as I said, it was decided that I leave, and my sister and my brother stayed behind. And there was one other person who worked for my father as an employee, and he was a distant relative, and he lived in that general area where I was going. So both he, who was older than I was, and I smuggled ourselves out from the Warsaw Ghetto. And by 1941, the ghetto was already closed. And a closed ghetto meant that it was surrounded, and if you had to go, you had to pass through a guard manned by assessment. So it was not possible to just leave it just because you want to leave. And also, even the Christian people had to have a good excuse for coming in. So that is really what it was meant by a closed. An open ghetto meant that you had to live there, but you were sort of like allowed to go in, or other people were allowed to go into the ghetto, the Christian people. So in 1941 it was already closed, and so it was necessary for my parents to bribe some Polish policemen who were sort of in charge of the border kind of thing. And I remember that the arrangement was there was a tramway that had to turn round, and the only way that it had to turn round by coming to an end of a line was through a small portion of the Jewish ghetto. And once it came in and out, that was the time when it was arranged that I jump in and sort of go behind and underneath the seats. And the policeman who was a bride was sort of sitting and guarding. And I wouldn't be surprised if the guards too were bribed. And once it was turned round, it was on the other side, it was on the Polish side, and sort of everything was like normal. But from this point on, one had to pretend that one was not a Jew. And that was not easy. That was very risky, very risky. And then our destination was to take some means of transportation to travel the 300 miles. And trains or buses, I don't know whether they were available, but it seems that the other person, he selected to take a little steamboat on the river Vistula that traveled down, must have taken about 2 or 3 days, definitely. So, an overnight, I seem to remember that. And it was pretty packed. I seem to recall it was a common type of transportation for peasants, because they brought the provision, you know, the food or potatoes or what have you, to Warsaw, to the general main population. It was 3 million people there. And they bought some items in Warsaw for the money they got from the produce, and they took them back. So the whole place sort of sat on the floor, really. It was full of these peasants. And it was a great fright on my part that they would recognize where I came from or what to do. And had they done that, they would have immediately taken me and given me over to the German. And at one point, I remember the German guard came, and they came only to see what was sort of being smuggled. Possibly they were interested in weapons, that no weapons were smuggled. And when they came to me and sort of looked, you know, I still remember now, it's more than 50 years, how my heart beat. And then when we arrived at destination, well, or close to the destination, again we had to walk to the particular home we wanted to reach. And he seemed to have known his way, so we walked along across sort of fields and small roads so that we were not seen. And we finally managed to arrive there. And that was his home. His father had a little farm. And I stayed a few days, and then I went to my relatives about 20 miles away from that particular place.
Do you remember the name of the relatives that you went to stay
No,
with?
yeah, Klotz, believe it or not.
How were they related? Your mother's family or your father's family?
I believe my father's side.
Do you happen to remember your mother's maiden name?
I believe that it was Laufman, but I'm never really sure of that. And when I asked my sister and my older brother, they too were not quite sure.
So now you've arrived at the family Klotz. In what city was this?
It was
A village?
a village. It was very unusual for Jewish people to own land, but he seemed to have had a little plot of land, and he made his living by carting lime from a quarry and selling it on a market, and this lime was used for painting the whitewashing of the walls of rooms. And he had a horse and a cow in a field or something like that.
It would be 2 more years, from Pesach of 41 until Pesach of 43, before the Warsaw Ghetto would have an uprising.
Yeah.
And of course you were not there during those
Right.
2 years. But do you have any recollection as to the feelings, the mentality of the Jewish community in the ghetto during this time? Did they perceive that this terrible situation would just continue indefinitely? Or was there an understanding of the ultimate doom that awaited the Polish Jews?
Right, the latter is true, yeah. Well, as you said, I wasn't there, but one heard, and I think it was also possible somehow either to write a letter or something. Yeah, I remember even once I tried to speak over the phone, but one had to line up in a main post office to be put through, and it was extremely hard to make contact with people living there. But my sister survived, and then I asked her, well, so it was continually worse. Yeah.
Tell us, after you got to your family, the Klotz, what happened next?
Well,
You were 12 years old at the time.
well, already by that time I was 2 years old, right? I did not intend to stay there, so this was my just stop for about 2 or 3 weeks, perhaps a month, and then I proceeded to my aunt, my father's brother, except that he was deceased, so there was only just the aunt.
But what was his name? Your uncle.
Ephraim,
And his wife, your aunt.
Ruth, called the Risha, and they had children about my age, and in fact one son, because they had no father, he must have been about 3 or 4 years older than I am. He sort of like looked after me in a way, and we went through the rest of the war actually like together, and he sort of like helped me. So it was My cousin and his brother and I, so as I said, we went through the rest of the war because this place in itself, the Ostrovets, did not last very long. So let me see, I think I had it written down somewhere, how it was. I arrived there, I think, 41. Yeah, the place itself was finished in 42. It was, again, there was a ghetto, perhaps not so strongly enforced ghetto, but it was all the same a ghetto. So between 41 and 42, in order, it was sort of like a general understanding that if you wanted to improve or increase your chances of life, you had to be doing something, be busy as some sort of. So I enrolled to work in a factory, which was existing there in Ostrovets. It was a very big factory, making iron. They
Making
iron,
iron.
yeah, from the ore. And of course, this was one thing that the Germans needed, in order to keep the military going. This iron was, they used it for making angle iron and making carriages and wheels and all sorts of things. So when I arrived there, within a few months, it was thought that it would be good to sort of become useful for something. So whilst I was still living with my aunt, I went to a certain place, I think, in the morning, and then as a group we marched down to that factory, and they renamed this factory Hermann Göring something, Eisenhütte. Eisen is the iron smelting company or something like that. And the work there was pretty hard, very hard. But at least we were able to live. It was not all that hard at first. And in the evening when we finished work, we came back and stayed home. But within a year it finished. What finished was that all the occupants were informed that they had to go to a marketplace and assemble there and take everything with them. Now those who were working in that particular place, like myself and my two cousins, we were sort of asked to go in a different place because we sort of had like a job, a reason for staying alive. So this ghetto in Ostrovets was liquidated in 1942, and I and my cousins lived in some barracks not far from the premises of that big factory. And my aunt and there was a young girl. I was just trying to think, there was just one girl or two, and a few other relatives which were also in that town, and the whole population was just taken away, never to be seen again.
What were the names of your cousins with whom you were placed in the barracks?
One was Samuel or Shmuel. No, his name was the same as my last name because my father and his deceased father were brothers.
Sosnovich, yes. Yeah. Shmuel was one and the other?
Yisroel or Struel. Yeah. And then we continued working in that place until 1944. And as I said, the food was not too bad somehow, and because we were somehow like in contact with the other workers who were non-Jews, it was already like a little window, and you could sort of do something with them, or they somehow had sort of pity and gave you a potato or something like that, so it was possible to live. And so we continued doing that until 1944, meaning about 2 years
Were
after.
there many Jews working in the ironworks?
Perhaps about 100 or 200, so not many.
And
Not
all
many.
stayed together in the barracks?
Yeah.
All young men or a
Yeah.
mixture?
Possibly I was the youngest. I sort of had to sort of sometimes dress up and pretend I was older. But the main thing was that there was a certain assigned work to be done. Most of the work was unloading, say coal unloading, what they call coke, which is a derivative of coal. And there was some iron. Sometimes we had to unload it, unload it. And the job there, according to my recollection, was that sort of like 2 or 3 people were assigned to do the job, to unload. And this was your assignment for the kind of shift. And we worked 3 shifts. So busy was the place. So the first shift, or the second, and the night shift. And when they had a lot of work, they could very frequently, and they did so very frequently after you came home, finishing off one day's work, within a few hours they drafted you again because there was a rush work to do of unloading or loading the trucks, carts, the wagons. And so we had a certain assignment, and if it was easy to do, if people were good at the work, then the work was done, and you sort of like let go.
Were you guarded constantly?
Not in that place, no. I mean, the whole place was surrounded. You couldn't get in, you couldn't get out, unless you were escorted.
Before you go on after 1944, would you go back to the events of 1943 when the Warsaw Ghetto was destroyed in Pesach of 43?
Yeah.
Were you aware of that happening? Was there any news of that event?
We were aware of it, but we were no longer in a home. We were no longer saw any newspapers. There was no real good communication. So it was sort of only rumors that we ourselves were already somewhat like prisoners.
Did your parents survive the Warsaw Ghetto uprising? No. Did they die in the uprising or before it?
I asked my sister because she survived. She couldn't tell me. She just didn't want to tell me.
What happened after 1944?
In 44, for some reason, I think could have been partly connected with the turn of events of the war itself. 44 was sort of like, sometimes it looked as if things were going to end pretty soon. In fact, in 44, if my history is correct, Paris was actually liberated already from that side, but from the east side, the Russians did not come in. But anyway, they decided to take all the people from that particular place to Auschwitz. We did not know where we were taken, but we knew that we had to present ourselves there rather than being taken to work. From the barracks to work, we were taken to trains. And that was the last we saw of that place. And not until we arrived in Auschwitz did we really know where we were going. It was all those closed up wagons, carriages, trains.
What happened when you got to Auschwitz?
If you've watched some of the TV movies, you know, there were quite a few. I think they were pretty well, very, very representative of what really happened. As it happens, the place, the Ostrovets where I worked, being 200 or 300 miles south of Warsaw, was not very far from Auschwitz, which was very close to Krakow, and a pretty well-known town, which was also in the south of Poland. So the journey from where we were to Auschwitz wasn't all that great, perhaps 6 hours or something by train. And of course we were not informed where we were being taken. And when we arrived there, then the usual thing happens. You sort of open, the doors were open because they were shut from outside, so you just couldn't, they were closed from completely, except perhaps tiny little grills. The doors were open, and immediately the SS men were standing all over with guns and dogs, and beating straight away just to sort of frighten you, and they pushed you in a certain direction, and it was pandemonium. Now, in our particular case, the people from that barrack, from the camp, were only men. So we just went in a certain direction where they asked us to go. Normally, if it was from a ghetto, there would have been perhaps men and women and children or something. So at that point, they would have been separated. So we were asked to go, and as I tried to explain at the very beginning, the first thing you go is sort of like a bath, where you were asked to be, you just strip off everything. Your head was shaven off. The hair was all cut, and when you that was a real bath, not a pretend one. And when you stepped outside, everything that you had with you was sort of already gone. You never went back. It was always sort of going in one direction.
Did all of you who came together on the train go together into this?
I believe so.
There was no selection?
I'm not too sure. I'm not too sure whether there was any selection. But normally there would be a selection, right? But it could be that we were sort of like already pre-selected, by virtue of the fact that we were able to carry out this work there. And as I said, it was extremely hard physical work to work in that for 2 years. So much so I remember that at night, in the middle of the winter, I was so tired I could fall asleep standing. So I cannot quite remember whether there was a selection at the time of arrival. Not in my particular case. There were selections later on.
After your shower, and you came out and your goods were gone, what happened next?
What happens next? You were given a number. Everyone had to have a number. In my particular case, the number is here. Other people had a number there.
May I see it, please? Dick, can you get in close on that? B5247.
And now this was, I was the last one. My two cousins had 46 and 45. The same, because we sort of tried to stay together, So he lined up and incidentally, I heard somebody ask another speaker, which we had in our congregation, whether it hurt in getting this number imprinted. But I can confirm that it did hurt. But compared to everything else that went on, a little bit of hurt, much as it did, because it's really a needle with a dye in it. And from that point on, we will never refer to by anything other than the number.
At that point, you were 16 years old.
Yeah.
What happened next?
Well, summer, fortunately, or so, it was already the summer of '44, the last 11 months of the war. And the crematoria, the ovens were still burning. And I remember we were sort of like asked to lie down there in some sort of a big hall. There were no beds or anything, not at least at this point. And in the middle of the night, the people were removed and never to be seen again. And we could see and smell, what was going on. And
Did you know when you came to Auschwitz what it was?
we soon somehow found out, yeah. There were these so-called Jewish kappas, The Germans were pretty clever in the work, and they asked other people to do the work for them. And part of the people were the Jews themselves. And they told us.
Were they cruel?
Yeah.
Did you have duties assigned to you at Auschwitz?
Right. Okay, I can continue with my story, and that is that the part of Auschwitz where we all arrived and had this sort of numbers was known as a Birkenau.
Auschwitz-Birkenau, yes.
And that's where the crematoria were. And then somehow there wasn't really much to do there. It was not a labor camp. And the food was very sparse, just a bit of soup and a piece of bread, and that was all. And so somehow after 2 or 3 weeks, my cousin and I, he was sort of the leader, of the gang. He told us we must run away from here. Not to run away, but an opportunity presented itself to go to an adjoining part of Auschwitz to do some work. And we already knew from the previous place where we worked that if you could do something and be occupied and sort of be productive in some way rather than just being a mass of bodies, then you had a greater chance. So at one time the German, I don't know who they were all in uniform. They came down, they said, who is it, Zimmerman?
The carpenter.
A carpenter. So my cousin puts up his name, and I raised my hand, and so we're all 3 Zimmerman. So we were, and then they were asked for a few other people who had some skills. Of course, nobody had that particular skill. I don't think that I even knew what the word Zimmerman was. But anyway, I volunteered. And then we were marched from that place to that other place. And the other place was a commercial, actually, place called IG Farben. It was a chemical company, comparable perhaps to DuPont here. And they made whatever chemicals were needed for the German army. And they needed these Zimmermans to repair bombed, damaged buildings. And this is what my work was there. Go up on scaffolding, on roofs, and do the carpenter work. So So the rest of our time, and it wasn't all that long, so it must have been from about July until January, that we worked in this, it was called Buna. I don't know where these words come from, but it was everybody referred to it as the Buna or Buna IG Farben. And there we worked, and it was again physical hard work. From time to time I saw some Allied airplanes come and try to bomb the factory, so it was quickly repaired and put back to work. And we stayed there until the winter, I think it was January already of 1945, where again, because of the changes in the war, they decided to close that Auschwitz. So the whole, not only our small group, but everyone, the whole Auschwitz complex was finished. And people were sent in all directions. And by send, in my particular case, it meant walking. And I remember walking perhaps like, 8 hours on end in the middle of the night, snow or anything. All your belongings, whatever you could carry, you just took. There wasn't really much to carry. I think they gave us a loaf of bread, or a portion of the loaf, and that was that. And there were quite a few people who, after marching for a few hours, just couldn't do it anymore. And so they just went to the side to either sit down in the snow or rest or do something. And immediately they were shot. And then when daybreak came, we somehow stopped in a place, I don't know if my memory is still right, was sort of Gleiwitz, I don't know where it was, on the way possibly to, going more towards the German border. It could very well be that not the whole Auschwitz went in that same direction. Some people had gone north or south or whatever. But I was in the group that was taken there. And after walking, as I said, for many hours and then resting and then walking again, we were finally put on trains. Again, the familiar trains, but I think in this particular case it was an open train. And we were taken through Czechoslovakia, into Germany, and into another camp called Buchenwald. So this must have been like the end of January. And Buchenwald was again a notorious camp. And strangely enough, we again sort of applied our formula, which worked at the slightest possible thing. We could try to see where was there something to do, to be again a useful thing. And they needed some workers in a place not far from Buchenwald. And we volunteered to go there. And it was, I think, in the place where they built the V1 or V2, the bombs that were produced, that bombed London or so. And there again was a question, the whole place was in a mountain. The place was called Gravwinkel. So I think it's possibly on the map as a town. But we lived in woods, in a mountain where it was sort of, scooped out, so it was all camouflaged. There was no light, there was no nothing. And this is where we slept. And in the morning we were sort of all assembled and taken by little trucks to the place of work. The work involved sort of loading and unloading various things. So it was more with military connection rather than civilian.
During the time that you were at Buchenwald, was it obvious what was going on there? Or was that hidden, as it also was in Auschwitz?
I'm not too sure whether we knew what was going on, but that too, it was a workplace, and you are under constant surveillance and supervision of the SS people, and whatever you asked to do, if it didn't please them, it was too slow or too fast to do this, they just could do anything with you. Shot you on the spot or hit you over the head. And
Were you physically mistreated?
yeah, but not to an extent that I suffered greatly. You know, just to get a wallop with a stick or so in the ribs over the head, that was sort of regarded as part and parcel of life.
Were you also physically mistreated during the time that you were in Auschwitz and shortly after at the IG Farben works?
No, strangely enough, not there. Yeah.
And at the ironworks prior to when you went to Auschwitz, were you physically mistreated?
No. So Buchenwald and the Gravenkel was, In fact, a lot of the soldiers somehow were Hungarian soldiers in that place, not in Buchenwald proper, but in that place called Gravenkel. And frequently they were with German Shepherd dogs, and they didn't like it. They just, gave orders to the dog to attack you and eat you up, or sort of bite you at least.
The dogs were trained to kill?
Yeah. If not to kill, to just,
Did you personally observe that ever happen?
Yeah. I had myself a dog caught me by the foot or something and bit me.
Had you done something to provoke that,
No,
or did they
no.
simply wanted to mistreat you?
Just, whether they did it for fun or just to show the power of us, that was quite important for them too.
The dogs managed by the capos or by the Hungarian soldiers?
Hungarian soldiers.
Up to this point, the ironworks, Auschwitz, IG Farben, Buchenwald, did you ever have any act of kindness demonstrated to you by anyone?
I think when I worked in the IG Farben thing, there were some civilians there too, German civilians. So we sort of like worked hand in hand with them in a way. They came in as civilians with the lunch and what have you. Even though it was wartime there for them, they had much more than we had. Occasionally they gave us a little bit of their own food.
Willingly?
Pardon?
Willingly, without being coerced?
Willingly, but they had to do it in such a way that they were not caught. They sort of like left it and walked away. And if you happened to be one of those who saw it, you were lucky to have it.
What happened next?
What happened next? Now things become sort of a very rapid tempo from that point on, because as I said, and again the events of the war were taken away from Auschwitz, which was Poland, because the Russians were coming, or they were supposed to come, but they stopped and didn't came until many months later. And then we were taken to the middle of Germany, Buchenwald. But then the Americans came from the other side. And the point came where we had to leave this Gravenkel, the underground bunker place. And then we again walked back to the main camp, which was Buchenwald. But it was already in somewhat disarray, because we could see the planes flying, we could hear the shots. And they have vacated the whole camp of Buchenwald. Some people decided to take a risk and stay and hide themselves somewhere on the camp of Buchenwald, believing that the Americans, the army, would be there within a few hours, perhaps a day or two. But on the other hand, the Germans were not so stupid. They went around and either dynamited the barracks, the places, or just looked around to see who was there, and if anybody was caught hiding or still alive, they were shot on the spot. So I did not have the courage to do that. And incidentally, by that time, we lost one of the cousins. I lost one of the cousins, and that was again it was in this Gravinkel place. One day, this cousin, Struel, it was already 45, just a few months before the end of the war, he didn't feel well. Stomach upset, so instead of going to work with us, he stayed behind. And when he came back, he was not there, not to be seen, not to be heard. So that was the way of dealing with people. So
how did they deal with them in Gravinkel? Did they take them back to Buchenwald for extermination, or did they shoot them there?
Either. I really would not know.
So then, any killings which took place in Gravinkel were not seen by the prisoners there?
That's correct, yeah. And another thing about this Gravinkel, and the same true for Auschwitz and Buchenwald, is this business of assembly.
The appell.
Appelle.
The appelle.
Yeah, that was something.
Can you describe the appelle, please?
Well, first of all, the sleeping accommodation, especially in this place like Gravinkel, it was, as I said, it was in a mountain, dark and wet, and they must have woken us about 4 o'clock. And we didn't go to bed until sort of late and tired, hungry. And there was really no reason for really waking us that early. And we had to go to this Appellplatz and be counted. And there we stood a good hour, an hour and a half in line, and we counted and waited, and it was winter and cold and undressed until some trucks or some other sort of vehicle came along and took us from this Appellplatz to the place of work. So this was a very, very uncomfortable thing. And the same thing happened in Auschwitz too. So every day we were woken up early when it was still dark, and we were given a small portion of bread, and I think there was some sort of like a black coffee, which it wasn't really coffee, it was sort of like an ersatz type coffee, and you had to show your number, they sort of like ticked it off or so, and then you had to sort of wash yourself in very primitive, cold conditions. And then you had to go to this Appellplatz and stand there and be counted. They really counted. And in Auschwitz, as you know, the clothes were sort of pyjama-type striped uniform. And they were not warm at all. And some people resorted to putting paper bags. The paper bags were cement bags to sort of underneath to just cater against the strong wind. But this was not allowed. And if the German SS caught somebody with this paper bag underneath the jacket, they could easily be killed or beaten up. And then frequently again in Auschwitz and other places on this Appellplatz, if someone tried to escape or do something, they called everybody up in the Appellplatz, and you had to witness the hanging of the court prisoners. And they did that in order to show what would happen if we were to try to escape. So we somehow knew, and that's why it wasn't all that common. We knew that it was impossible to escape. Even if you could physically escape, you had to deal with the Polish population who would turn you in. And also the fact that you had a number, and the fact that you had that clothes, and the fact that you didn't have any hair, it was just impossible. Places like that.
Tell us of the last few months.
The last, now the Americans, we could already see the planes, and we could see the bombs and the fire and the shots and everything. And I said earlier, some people decided to take a risk and sort of run out and hide themselves and wait for the American army to come in. And I joined the larger group that followed the orders, and we were marched and taken again on the trains. And this was a very, possibly the hardest. First of all, we walked, because the trains, were not always nearby. And then we were put on the trains, and then it must have taken about 10 days until we somehow arrived at a destination, and then we could see it was very disorganized. The German soldiers themselves did not know where to go, what's happening. And there was hardly anything to eat over the 10 days, and a lot of people died. And when we arrived at the destination, and that was Theresienstadt in Czechoslovakia, it must have been about a quarter of the number of people that we started off with. Every morning we sort of saw some people who were alive the previous evening dead, and we just had to throw them down, out of the train. And that was that. Now when we arrived in Theresienstadt, that was already like April, very close to the end of the war. And I cannot remember too much of this Theresienstadt, other than it looked definitely very different from the camps I've seen before. It was sort of more like a civilized place. And main reason why I couldn't quite remember, I think I was beginning to be sick. And I think we had to possibly wait there in that Theresienstadt for about, I would say about 2 or 3 weeks. And then we heard that it was the 8th of May, and that the Germans were running away, and that the Russian army came and took the place over. And so that was the end of the war, but not necessarily the end of the suffering.
How much did you weigh when the Russians finally came in? You were then 17 years old,
Yeah.
and the average weight of a 17-year-old male, your height might be as much as 150 or 160 pounds. That would
Yeah.
be under normal conditions.
Yeah.
Do you remember what you
No,
weighed?
first of all, I never weighed myself. There was
You
no.
estimated?
I think I was very thin, and I said I was. I was already, for the first time actually, that I got sick. So much so that when the Germans were actually running away, which was May the 8th, perhaps 7th or something, I was too weak to go to the windows or go outside to really see the event.
Did you perform any duties in Theresienstadt?
No, I don't think
You
so.
just stayed there?
Yeah.
Was your illness as a result of malnutrition?
Yeah. And then somehow, possibly because of the, I fainted quite a lot of times. And when food became available, everyone was perhaps a little bit too greedy and they ate too much, so that made them sick even more, you know. But then I remember going to a hospital in Dresdenstadt, and it was an army hospital. The doctors were Russian soldiers. It was an army type hospital, and I sort of tried to do something with me, just to keep me alive. But I think on one occasion, I'm sure that they have sort of like given up on me as being almost dead. But I somehow managed to survive.
Was your illness diagnosed?
Yeah. I had pneumonia and pleurisy and finally TB. But this diagnosis was done in England. So when the war ended in May, I was sort of like sick, possibly in June and July. And in July I was already better, to the extent that there was a special arrangement were made for the orphans, you know, for the young people to be assembled. To be soon after the war, people had to be on their own. Really, there was nobody to look after you, kind of thing. Only the voluntary organizations, Jewish organizations and non-Jewish organizations, and typically the non-Jewish people went home. You know, if it was a Polish prisoner, he knew where exactly to go home. There were Russians, people from Czechoslovakia, people from France. Those people who want to go back to Poland, first of all, there were very few who wanted to go back to Poland because we knew what would be awaiting us there. But I've heard that some people did go back to Poland, and I also know that there was a massacre by the Poles on the Jews when they came back, because the Poles believed that the Jews came back, those who survived, to repossess their property, and they didn't want that, so they killed them. But my cousin or I, we did not try. But at that point, sort of my cousin, who was 3 or 4 years older, and I had to part ways because I was still qualified to be regarded as a youth person.
At 17?
Yeah. Well, they actually had to change the date of birth. You know, we had no documentation. You could call yourself anything you want. You could give any date you want. Usually people did not change the name at that point because they hoped perhaps there was a survivor who would look for your own name. So, so there were some organizers there in Theresienstadt, and they made me up a little certificate with my name and they put the date of birth at 1930 rather than 1927. And not only did they do it in my case, but everyone else who went in that group, with that group, to England, because England accepted only those young people, so-called orphans, who didn't have any parents, who didn't have any profession, who could not cater for them.
How was England selected? Who selected it? How did you get from the hospital to England?
can't remember the details, except I know that we had to be in a certain place in Prague. You know, Theresienstadt was not far from Prague.
Mm-hmm.
And the Jewish agencies sent some people to organize to help the repatriate people.
But were you given the choice of going back to Poland?
I'm not too sure whether I was
You
given
were
the
simply
choice.
told you're going to England.
I was told I could go to England, yes. And so I was sort of regarded as in a privileged position. And we did go to England. And we left Prague on August the 15th. I just happened to look up some. I'm not so sure whether it's on this page. Anyway, August the 14th or the 15th. And we were picked up by the RAF airplanes, bombers. And I remember it was not a passenger airplane. Also, I remember this was the first time in my life that I was in a plane. So there were no seats. We sort of just sat on the floor. The windows were still painted with the blue paint, or sort of camouflage or something. But I remember the pilots were very friendly to us. And they packed in as many as possible in a plane. And it could be there were several planes. And all this was organized by the British Jewish community, refugee community. And the plane landed in a disused RAF plane, airport. And the barracks, again, you know, the housing accommodation was again used before we used them by the pilots. But since the war ended, there was no need for them to have that. So this was our sort of like a reception center there.
Before we continue at that point, Sheila, do you have any questions to ask about this period of during the war?
Your cousin who survived
Yeah.
stayed with you all the time up
Yeah.
until Theresienstadt.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Yeah.
And in the time, did you get any, when you were going from camp to camp, did you have any idea in those camps what was going on in the outside world?
No.
You never had contact
No.
with anyone?
We didn't even know where we were going. As I said, it was a very long and arduous trip from Theresienstadt from Buchenwald to Theresienstadt. I don't know how many miles. It took us 10 days. We did not know which direction we're going, what we're doing. It was just living from minute to minute.
I have no other questions.
This might be a good time to change tapes.